In the hallowed halls of Madrid's Prado Museum, one painting reigns supreme: Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas. Central to this masterpiece is a vision of innocence, a young girl bathed in light, her golden hair cascading around her face, her eyes wide and direct, engaging the viewer with disarming candor. This is Margarita Teresa of Spain, immortalized circa 1656 at the tender age of 5. But behind that radiant fade lies a chilling narrative, a life preordained by the ruthless calculus of royal lineage and political machinations, a destiny far removed from fairy tales and happy endings. Margarita Teresa was a scion of the Habsburg dynasty, a lineage notorious for its obsession with preserving its bloodline, a pursuit that led them down a path of sanctioned incest. Her own parents were uncle and niece, and her future husband would also be her uncle. Before her untimely death at 21, she endured 6 pregnancies, countless miscarriages, and untold suffering, all in the service of safeguarding a bloodline that was steadily self-destructing. This is not a romantic tale of royal matrimony, but a stark account of a young woman whose very existence was sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition, a tragic example of power's insidious reach. Margarita Teresa's fleeting life serves as a chilling illustration of how political power can pervert the most fundamental human connections, transforming familial bonds into tools of exploitation and control. Her saga unfolds within the opulent yet suffocating confines of 17th century Spanish royalty, a realm where children were regarded as commodities and affection was a rare and precious luxury. In this world, Margarita Teresa was never truly free, even in her childhood. From the moment she entered the world, she was not her own person, but rather a possession of an empire poised to devour her entirely. The Spanish Empire of her time was already showing ominous signs of the decline that would ultimately lead to its demise. The very obsession with bloodline purity that had once propelled the Habsburgs to dominance across Europe was now eroding them from within. Margarita Teresa would become both a symbol and a victim of this decline, a princess whose captivating beauty masked a profound tragedy, revealing the horrifying price of unbridled power and the human cost of political avarice. Gazing upon Velázquez's masterpiece today, we perceive not merely artistic brilliance, but a poignant historical testament, a silent scream frozen in time. That golden-haired child embodies the fading glimmer of Habsburg Spain's glory, blissfully unaware that her brief life would be a sacrificial offering to sustain that dying light. The painting captures her at what may have been the only truly unburdened moment of her existence, a child frolicking in her father's court, before the relentless machinery of royal marriage ensnared her. Within a decade, she would be wed to her uncle and dispatched to Austria, commencing a relentless cycle of pregnancy and loss that would define her remaining years and ultimately claim her life. To fully comprehend Margarita Teresa's fate, we must delve into the history of the dynasty that shaped it. The House of Habsburg had held dominion over vast territories across Europe for centuries, amassing power through strategic marriages designed to keep wealth and influence concentrated within the family. However, what originated as political wisdom gradually morphed into something far more sinister, a systematic practice of incest that the family elevated to the level of sacred duty, a tradition cloaked in the guise of piety and political expediency. The Habsburg marriage strategy was brutally straightforward: intermarry to prevent the fragmentation of territories and to supposedly maintain the purity of royal blood. This meant uncles marrying nieces, cousins marrying cousins, and brothers-in-law becoming sons-in-law in a never-ending cycle of genetic entanglement. The Habsburg family tree bore less resemblance to a tree than to a tangled, twisted vine, repeatedly coiling back upon itself. By the 17th century, the repercussions of this policy were becoming undeniable. Habsburg children were increasingly afflicted with physical deformities, intellectual disabilities, and a host of debilitating health problems. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a pronounced protrusion of the lower jaw resulting from generations of inbreeding, became so exaggerated in some family members that they could barely eat or articulate themselves clearly. Yet, despite these evident consequences, the family persisted in their practice, clinging to the belief that the purity of their bloodline was worth any sacrifice, a delusion that blinded them to the suffering they were perpetuating. The Spanish branch of the Habsburg family, into which Margarita Teresa was born, was particularly notorious for its extreme reliance on inbreeding. Her father, Philip IV of Spain, was himself the product of countless incestuous unions. Her mother, Mariana of Austria, was Philip's own niece, the daughter of his sister, Maria Anna, and Emperor Ferdinand III. This made Margarita Teresa's genetic heritage a concentrated and perilous cocktail of Habsburg DNA, with all the inherent risks amplified. The court physicians and advisors who served the Habsburgs were acutely aware of the detrimental effects of inbreeding, yet they dared not voice dissent against royal policy. Instead, they fabricated elaborate justifications for the necessity of maintaining royal blood's purity and for why marriages outside the family would somehow contaminate the divinely ordained nature of Habsburg rule. These arguments were devoid of any scientific basis, rooted instead in a toxic brew of superstition, xenophobia, and political convenience, a smokescreen designed to conceal the truth. The reality was that the Habsburg obsession with bloodline purity had spawned a dynasty of invalids and weaklings who struggled to fulfill even the most basic responsibilities of leadership. Yet, they persisted in arranging marriages between close relatives, deluding themselves into believing that each successive generation would somehow escape the genetic curse they had themselves unleashed. Margarita Teresa entered this world of deliberate ignorance and systemic self-destruction. What renders her story particularly tragic is that by the time of her birth in 1651, alternative marriage strategies were gaining traction among other European royal families. The French Bourbons and the English Stuarts had begun to seek alliances with more distant relatives or even foreign nobility, acknowledging that political alliances could be forged without incurring the genetic costs of extreme inbreeding. The Habsburgs, however, remained steadfast in their catastrophic policy, condemning yet another generation to endure the consequences of their stubborn adherence to a destructive tradition, a testament to their unwavering commitment to a doomed ideology. Margarita Teresa was born on July 12, 1651, within the walls of the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, a sprawling palace complex that served as the nerve center of Spanish power. Her arrival was greeted with empire-wide celebrations, not out of genuine affection for her as an individual, but because she represented a valuable asset in the ongoing game of European politics. From her very first breath, she was not simply Margarita Teresa, the person, but Margarita Teresa, the potential marriage alliance, a pawn on the chessboard of dynastic ambition. Her father, Philip IV, was 51 years old at the time of her birth, an aging monarch already burdened by the failures of his reign. Spain was losing its grip on its vast empire, suffering military setbacks in Europe and economic woes at home. Philip desperately needed political alliances to bolster his crumbling kingdom, and his newborn daughter represented a precious bargaining chip in those crucial negotiations, a commodity to be traded for political advantage. Her mother, Mariana of Austria, was a mere 22 years old, but already well-versed in the brutal realities of Habsburg marriage politics. Mariana had been wed to her uncle Philip at the tender age of 14, dispatched from Vienna to Madrid to fulfill the needs of the Spanish monarchy. Now she watched her own daughter embark on the same tragic path, fully cognizant of the fate that awaited the child, yet powerless to intervene. The infant Margarita Teresa was immediately surrounded by a court that viewed her primarily through the lens of her future reproductive value. Palace officials commenced discussions about potential marriage arrangements before she could even take her first steps, meticulously analyzing which unions would yield the greatest political benefits for Spain. Her education, her passions, her personal preferences, none of these held any significance in comparison to her utility as a diplomatic instrument, a tool to be wielded in the pursuit of political objectives. Despite the cold calculations that surrounded her birth, contemporary accounts suggest that Margarita Teresa possessed remarkable intelligence and a spirited nature. She mastered languages with ease, exhibited genuine artistic talent, and possessed a natural charisma that captivated visitors to the Spanish court. However, these very qualities only augmented her value as a commodity. A captivating princess would command a higher price in the marriage market than one who was plain or unremarkable. Her early years were meticulously documented by court artists, most notably in Velázquez's paintings. These artworks depict a beautiful child bearing the characteristic Habsburg features, the prominent lower lip and pale complexion that betrayed her genetic heritage, but they also capture something more profound, a spark of vitality and innocence that would soon be extinguished by the crushing weight of dynastic expectations, a fleeting moment of untainted joy before the darkness descended. The Spanish court of Margarita Teresa's childhood was a stage for elaborate ceremonies and rigid protocol, where every facet of daily life was governed by rules meticulously designed to uphold royal dignity and maintain distance from the common masses. She was forbidden from playing with ordinary children, denied the right to express preferences that might clash with state interests, and never afforded the chance to cultivate relationships based on affection rather than political expediency. Her world was beautiful yet sterile, magnificent yet ultimately devoid of genuine human connection. As Margarita Teresa transitioned from infancy to childhood, the Spanish court embarked on the process of molding her into the ideal royal bride, a task carried out with ruthless efficiency. Her education was not intended to cultivate her intellect or nurture her talents, but to transform her into an acceptable offering to whichever foreign prince could best serve Spanish interests. Every element of her upbringing was carefully calibrated to maximize her value in the international marriage market, a relentless pursuit of political advantage. Her formal education placed a heavy emphasis on languages, particularly German and Latin, as it was already understood that she would likely marry into the Austrian branch of the Habsburg family. She was taught to speak, read, and write in multiple languages, but these skills were not meant to broaden her intellectual horizons. Instead, they were practical instruments that would enable her to function effectively as a diplomatic asset in a foreign court, a translator of political ambitions. Religious instruction occupied a central position in her daily routine, but even this was shaped by political considerations, twisted to serve the interests of the dynasty. She was rigorously trained in the specific forms of Catholic devotion favored by the Austrian Habsburgs, ensuring that her future in-laws would find her sufficiently pious and compliant. Her spiritual education stressed submission, sacrifice, and the divine right of king's lessons designed to justify whatever personal sacrifices her marriage might demand of her. Physical education for Margarita Teresa centered on cultivating the grace and poise expected of a Habsburg princess. She was taught to dance, ride horses, and carry herself with the dignity that befitted her station, all for the sake of appearances. However, she was also subjected to stringent dietary restrictions and lifestyle limitations that the court deemed necessary to preserve her health for future childbearing, a stark reminder that her body was viewed as a vessel for producing heirs. Her body, like her mind, was being meticulously prepared for service to the dynasty, an incubator for royal blood. The paintings and portraits from this period depict a child who was undeniably intelligent and alert, but they also reveal something unsettling in her expression, a premature solemnity that hints at her awareness of the destiny that awaited her, a burden too heavy for such young shoulders. Unlike other children who might dream of adventure or romance, Margarita Teresa understood that her future had already been decided by others, and that her personal desires would never be factored into that decision, a crushing realization for any child. Court records from this period unveil the extent to which her daily life was meticulously monitored and controlled, every aspect scrutinized. Every meal, every lesson, every social interaction was documented and analyzed for its potential impact on her suitability as a bride, a relentless assessment. She was forbidden from forming close friendships with anyone who might sway her against her predetermined path, nor was she permitted to express preferences that might complicate future marriage negotiations, a systematic suppression of her individuality. Perhaps most disturbing of all, palace physicians subjected her to regular examinations to assess her physical development and reproductive potential, reducing her to a mere biological specimen. These examinations, which commenced when she was barely 10 years old, were conducted with the cold detachment of livestock breeding. The doctor's reports, meticulously preserved in court archives, discuss her body in purely functional terms, evaluating her capacity to bear children for the glory of the Habsburg dynasty, a chilling objectification of a young girl. By the time Margarita Teresa celebrated her 11th birthday, serious negotiations for her marriage were already underway. The Spanish court had identified their preferred candidate, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor and head of the Austrian branch of the Habsburg family, a man who held her fate in his hands. Leopold was Margarita Teresa's uncle, her mother's brother, rendering this union yet another glaring example of the Habsburg family's deeply ingrained incestuous marriage policy, a pattern of self-destruction disguised as tradition. The marriage negotiations laid bare the brutal calculations that fueled Habsburg diplomacy, a ruthless pursuit of power and lineage. Spanish ministers viewed the union as crucial for maintaining the family's stranglehold on power in both Spain and Austria, a desperate attempt to cling to fading glory. With Philip IV's male heir, Prince Philip Prospero, frail and unlikely to survive to adulthood, Margarita Teresa represented one of the few remaining opportunities to solidify the alliance between the two Habsburg branches before the Spanish line vanished entirely, a gamble with the life of a child. Leopold himself was 23 years old when the marriage was proposed, a seasoned veteran of political marriages that had failed to produce the heirs his dynasty so desperately craved. His first wife, his own niece Margaret Teresa, another product of Habsburg inbreeding, had died young after a brief, childless marriage, a grim omen for the future. The Austrian court saw Margarita Teresa as a new chance to perpetuate the Habsburg bloodline, regardless of the genetic risks posed by yet another incestuous union, a willingness to sacrifice her well-being for the sake of the dynasty. The negotiations dragged on for months, with both courts haggling over dowries, territorial concessions, and succession rights, treating her as a piece of property to be bartered rather than arranging a child's future. Spanish diplomats emphasized Margarita Teresa's beauty, intelligence, and potential fertility, while Austrian representatives demanded assurances regarding her health and breeding capacity, a dehumanizing assessment of her worth. At no point during these discussions was the girl herself consulted about her preferences or feelings. Her voice was deliberately silenced. Contemporary documents reveal the chilling precision with which the marriage was planned. Palace physicians furnished detailed reports on Margarita Teresa's physical development, predicting her reproductive timeline and estimating the number of children she might be expected to produce, a grim forecast. Court astrologers calculated the most auspicious dates for the wedding and its consummation, while diplomats orchestrated the intricate logistics of transferring a Spanish princess to Austrian control, a meticulously planned transaction. The financial aspects of the negotiation were particularly revealing. Spain was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, struggling to finance its military endeavors and maintain its vast empire, a kingdom in decline. The Spanish court offered an exorbitant dowry for Margarita Teresa, a sum they could barely afford because they desperately needed the Austrian alliance to survive, a desperate measure. This meant that the young princess was not merely being sold into marriage, but sold at a premium that would further impoverish her homeland, a sacrifice of her nation's resources. Religious authorities were enlisted to provide moral justification for the incestuous union, generating theological arguments about the divine nature of Habsburg blood and the necessity of preserving its purity, a perversion of faith. These religious leaders, many of whom owed their positions to royal patronage, conveniently disregarded the manifest health problems stemming from inbreeding, focusing instead on abstract concepts of dynastic righteousness and divine will, a calculated act of hypocrisy. The marriage contract between Margarita Teresa and Leopold I was finalized in 1663 when she was a mere 12 years old, a child robbed of her innocence. The agreement stipulated that the actual ceremony would take place when she reached 14, an age that the Habsburg courts considered appropriate for marriage and immediate childbearing, a chilling disregard for her well-being. This afforded the Spanish court 2 years to complete her preparation for what would effectively be her sale to the Austrian branch of the family, a period of intense indoctrination and preparation. The final months leading up to her departure from Spain were filled with intensified education aimed at making her acceptable to her new family, a relentless molding of her identity. She received extensive instruction in Austrian court customs, Habsburg family history, and the specific expectations that would govern her conduct as Leopold's wife, all designed to erase her individuality. These lessons emphasized her primary duty to produce male heirs who would perpetuate the Habsburg line, irrespective of the personal cost to herself, a stark reminder of her sole purpose. The wedding ceremony itself occurred by proxy in Madrid on April 25, 1666, with Margarita Teresa adorned in an elaborate gown that emphasized her youth and innocence, a symbol of what was about to be lost. The Austrian ambassador stood in for Leopold during the religious service, while the 14-year-old bride recited vows that bound her to a man she had never met in a life she could scarcely imagine, a forced commitment. Palace records portray her as pale and silent during the ceremony, exhibiting none of the joy typically associated with weddings, a grim premonition of her future. Immediately following the proxy wedding, Margarita Teresa embarked on the arduous journey from Madrid to Vienna, accompanied by a vast entourage comprising Spanish nobles, servants, and guards tasked with ensuring her safe delivery to her new husband, a carefully orchestrated procession. The journey spanned several months, during which she was displayed to curious crowds in various European cities, a living testament to the alliance between the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs, a public spectacle. Contemporary accounts of the journey depict a young woman who appeared increasingly withdrawn and anxious as she neared her destination, a growing sense of dread. Foreign diplomats who encountered her during various stops noted her intelligence and beauty, but also commented on her evident apprehension about her future, a palpable sense of unease. She had been raised to understand her duty, but no amount of preparation could fully equip a 14-year-old for the reality of marriage to a stranger in a foreign land, a daunting prospect. Her arrival in Vienna on December 5, 1666, was celebrated with lavish displays intended to underscore the importance of the Habsburg alliance, a show of power and wealth. The Austrian court spared no expense in welcoming their new empress, organizing festivals, parades, and religious ceremonies that stretched for weeks, a carefully choreographed performance. However, these public displays of jubilation could not mask the underlying reality. A terrified teenager was being delivered to fulfill obligations she barely comprehended, a sacrificial lamb. The actual wedding ceremony took place on December 12, 1666, within the majestic confines of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, a setting of grand ceremony. Leopold, now 26 years old and 12 years her senior, was described by witnesses as courteous but distant during the proceedings, a relationship built on obligation rather than affection. Margarita Teresa, wearing another elaborate gown that seemed to overwhelm her small frame, went through the motions of the service with the mechanical precision of someone who had been meticulously trained for this moment, her joy absent, a hollow performance. Margarita Teresa's married life commenced immediately after the wedding ceremony, with the expectation that she would swiftly become pregnant and begin producing the heirs that both Habsburg branches desperately required, a relentless pressure. The Austrian court made no allowances for her youth or the traumatic nature of her situation, a complete disregard for her well-being. She was now an empress, and that title came with reproductive obligations that could not be delayed or avoided, a burden she was forced to bear. Leopold himself appears to have been a reasonably decent man by the standards of his era, but he was also a product of the Habsburg system, which viewed marriage primarily as a political and reproductive arrangement, a prisoner of tradition. While he treated Margarita Teresa with formal respect and even cultivated what might be described as affection for her, he never questioned the fundamental premise that her primary value lay in her capacity to bear children for the dynasty, a limited view of her worth. The young empress was immediately placed under the watchful eyes of Austrian court ladies, whose role was to monitor her health, regulate her diet, and ensure that she fulfilled her reproductive duties as efficiently as possible, a constant surveillance. These women, many of whom were themselves victims of arranged marriages within the Habsburg system, displayed little empathy for Margarita Teresa's evident distress and homesickness, a lack of compassion. Palace physicians initiated monthly examinations to track her menstrual cycle and determine the optimal time for conception, a clinical assessment. These examinations, conducted with the cold detachment of veterinary inspections, were documented in court records that discussed her body in purely functional terms, stripping her of her humanity. The doctors' reports focused solely on her reproductive potential, treating her emotional and psychological state as irrelevant to their assessments, a dehumanizing approach. Margarita Teresa's first pregnancy was announced in early 1667, less than 3 months after her wedding, a swift and calculated outcome. The court celebrated this news as proof that the marriage alliance was already bearing fruit, but the young empress herself appears to have been terrified by the prospect of childbirth at the tender age of 15, a daunting task. Court records from this period describe her as increasingly anxious and withdrawn, struggling to adapt to her new role while grappling with the physical and emotional challenges of pregnancy, a constant struggle. The Austrian court's treatment of pregnant empresses was notably harsh, based on the conviction that strict discipline and constant monitoring were essential for ensuring healthy births, a rigid and unforgiving approach. Margarita Teresa was subjected to a rigid routine that dictated every aspect of her daily life, from her diet and exercise to her social interactions and entertainment, a controlled existence. She was essentially confined within the palace walls, denied any independence or personal freedom that might interfere with her reproductive function, a prisoner of her own womb. Her isolation was compounded by the linguistic and cultural differences that separated her from the majority of the Austrian court, a sense of alienation. While she had learned German during her childhood education, the rapid pace and informal dialects of courtly conversation often left her feeling confused and excluded from social interactions, an outsider looking in. She found herself increasingly reliant on the Spanish retainers who had accompanied her from Madrid, forming a small enclave of familiar faces within an otherwise alien environment, a longing for home. Margarita Teresa's first pregnancy ended in tragedy in late 1667 when she miscarried after 7 months, a devastating loss. The loss profoundly affected her both physically and emotionally, but the court's reaction centered solely on when she might conceive again rather than on her recovery and well-being, a callous response. Palace physicians attributed the miscarriage to her youth and inexperience, advocating for immediate efforts to conceive another child before her body could forget its reproductive function, a heartless suggestion. The pattern that would define the rest of her brief life was established with brutal clarity: pregnancy, loss, a brief period of recovery, and immediate pressure to conceive again, a cycle of despair. The Austrian court treated each pregnancy as a state enterprise, with teams of doctors, midwives, and court officials monitoring every aspect of her condition, a relentless scrutiny. When pregnancies culminated in miscarriage or infant death, the response was never empathy or concern for her suffering, but instead a calculation of how quickly the process could be restarted, a cold assessment. Her second pregnancy, beginning in early 1668, was marked by even more intensive medical supervision, a desperate attempt to control the outcome. Court physicians, determined to prevent another miscarriage, subjected her to treatments that were often more detrimental than beneficial, a misguided approach. She was subjected to bloodletting, forced to ingest various herbal concoctions, and required to remain confined to her bed for extended periods, all based on outdated medical theories that lacked any scientific validity, a dangerous reliance on superstition. This pregnancy also ended in loss, with Margarita Teresa delivering a stillborn daughter in November 1668, another devastating blow. The emotional toll of this second tragedy was evident to everyone at court, but her grief was treated as a temporary inconvenience rather than a legitimate human response to a heartbreaking loss, a lack of understanding. Court records from this period describe her as increasingly melancholy and withdrawn, but these observations were coupled with concerns about how her emotional state might affect future pregnancies, rather than with any desire to address her suffering, a twisted priority. The pressure to conceive again intensified after the second miscarriage, as both the Austrian and Spanish courts began to fear that their investment in the marriage might not yield the desired results, a sense of desperation. Letters exchanged between Vienna and Madrid during this period reveal growing anxiety about Margarita Teresa's reproductive capacity and the possibility that the Habsburg alliance might fail to produce the next generation of rulers, a fear of dynastic collapse. Her third pregnancy commenced in 1669, and this time she successfully carried the pregnancy to term, giving birth to a daughter, Archduchess Maria Antonia, in January 1670, a moment of fleeting joy. The court celebrated this birth as a vindication of their marriage strategy, but the celebration was short-lived, a brief respite. The constant strain of pregnancy and childbirth at such a young age had taken a severe toll on Margarita Teresa's health, and she struggled to recover from the difficult delivery, a body worn down by constant demands. Despite her obvious physical and emotional exhaustion, the pressure to produce additional children persisted unabated, a relentless burden. Court physicians declared her fit enough for another pregnancy within months of Maria Antonia's birth, commencing a cycle that would continue until her death, a death sentence. The brief period of celebration following her daughter's birth was quickly supplanted by a renewed focus on when she would conceive the male heir that the dynasty so desperately needed, an insatiable desire. By 1670, the repeated pregnancies and miscarriages had severely damaged Margarita Teresa's health, a body ravaged by childbearing. Court physicians noted that she was frequently ill, suffered from chronic fatigue, and showed symptoms of what we would now recognize as severe depression, a decline in health. However, these medical professionals, operating under intense pressure from the Habsburg courts, continued to pronounce her fit for additional pregnancies, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, a denial of reality. Her fourth pregnancy began in late 1670, but this pregnancy was marked by complications from the outset, a troubled beginning. She suffered from severe morning sickness, persistent bleeding, and episodes of fainting that alarmed even the court doctors who had previously dismissed her health concerns, a belated recognition of her failing health. However, the political imperative to produce more heirs was so powerful that medical treatment focused on maintaining the pregnancy rather than safeguarding her overall health, a skewed priority. The psychological toll of her situation had become undeniable by this point, a growing despair. Spanish diplomats reported that Margarita Teresa had become withdrawn and fearful, spending extended periods in her private chambers and exhibiting little interest in court activities. In increasing isolation, she reportedly expressed a longing for her childhood home in Spain and seemed to understand that she was unlikely to survive much longer under the prevailing circumstances, a sense of foreboding. Her relationship with Leopold during this period appears to have been complicated by guilt and frustration on both sides, a complex dynamic. While he genuinely cared for her, he was also under immense pressure from his advisors and the broader Habsburg system to continue pursuing additional heirs, a divided loyalty. Palace records suggest that he was increasingly torn between his personal feelings for his young wife and his dynastic obligations as Holy Roman Emperor, a conflict of conscience. The fourth pregnancy culminated in another devastating miscarriage in mid-1671, leaving Margarita Teresa physically and emotionally shattered, a breaking point. Court physicians reported that she had difficulty recovering from this loss, displaying symptoms of what they described as a melancholic disposition and weakness of spirit, a clear sign of depression. Modern medical experts examining these historical records have suggested that she was likely suffering from severe depression and potentially post-traumatic stress disorder, a psychological toll. Despite her clearly deteriorating condition, the pressure for additional pregnancies persisted, a relentless demand. The Spanish succession crisis was intensifying as it became evident that King Charles II, Margarita Teresa's half-brother, was unlikely to produce heirs, a looming threat. This heightened the value of her potential sons to the Habsburg cause, creating even more pressure for her to continue bearing children, regardless of the cost to her well-being, a tragic burden. Her fifth pregnancy commenced in early 1672, but by this point, her body was clearly failing under the relentless strain, a body giving out. Court records depict her as increasingly frail and prone to illness, suffering from chronic pain and episodes of bleeding that alarmed even the most callous court physicians, a growing alarm. However, the political machinery of the Habsburg system had gained too much momentum to be halted, and the pregnancy continued, despite mounting concerns about her survival, a point of no return. Margarita Teresa's fifth pregnancy would prove to be her last, a final act of sacrifice. Throughout 1672, her health continued to decline as court physicians struggled to sustain both her life and the pregnancy that was slowly killing her, a losing battle. Palace records from this period paint a picture of a young woman who was clearly dying, yet still subjected to medical interventions designed to maximize the chances of producing a living heir rather than preserving her own life, a heartless calculation. The pregnancy was beset by complications from the beginning, including persistent bleeding, severe pain, and signs of infection that the court doctors were ill-equipped to treat effectively, a situation spiraling out of control. By the autumn of 1672, it was apparent to everyone at court that both mother and child were in grave danger, but the political pressure to continue the pregnancy remained overwhelming, a relentless force. The Habsburg system had invested too much in this union to concede defeat, even at the cost of Margarita Teresa's life, a grim determination. Leopold himself appeared genuinely distressed by his wife's condition during her final months, a growing concern. Contemporary accounts describe him as increasingly anxious and withdrawn, spending extended hours at her bedside and consulting with physicians about possible treatments, a desperate search for a solution. However, he was ultimately powerless to override the system that had brought them together, and his personal feelings could not compete with the dynastic pressures that demanded continued attempts at producing heirs. A powerlessness. On March 12, 1673, Margarita Teresa went into premature labor after months of declining health, a catastrophic event. The delivery was disastrous, with both mother and child perishing in the process, a tragic outcome. She was only 21 years old, and the stillborn infant in her womb represented the ultimate tragedy of a life entirely devoted to serving Habsburg ambitions, a life cut short. Palace records describe the scene as horrific, with the young empress dying in agony while court officials fretted more about the political ramifications of her death than about the human tragedy unfolding before them, a cold-hearted reaction. The immediate aftermath of her death revealed the cold calculations that had governed her entire existence, a stark contrast to the grief that should have been felt. Rather than mourning the loss of a young woman who had sacrificed everything for the dynasty, court officials immediately initiated discussions regarding Leopold's need for a new wife who could continue the reproductive work that Margarita Teresa had been unable to complete, a shocking display of callousness. Her body was scarcely cold before marriage negotiations began for Leopold's next union, a quick replacement. The Spanish court's reaction to the news of her death was similarly devoid of compassion. Instead of grieving for a daughter who had been sold into reproductive slavery at the age of 14, Spanish officials focused on the failure of the marriage alliance and the need to find alternative strategies for preserving Habsburg power, a focus on politics over human life. The girl who had been hailed as the empire's most prized asset was swiftly forgotten once she could no longer serve its needs, a disposable pawn. Her funeral in Vienna was elaborate and costly, designed to project the continuing power and prestige of the Habsburg dynasty, rather than to honor the individual woman who had died in its service. A final act of exploitation. The ceremonies lasted for weeks and consumed enormous sums of money, yet they represented a final act of exploitation, exploiting even her death as a propaganda tool for the system that had consumed her, a cruel legacy. Margarita Teresa's death marked a pivotal moment in the decline of the Habsburg dynasty, though the link was not immediately apparent to contemporaries. A turning point, her failure to produce male heirs contributed to the succession crisis that would eventually dismantle Spanish Habsburg power, while her daughter, Maria Antonia, would inherit the genetic maladies that plagued the entire family line, a continuation of the cycle. The collapse of the Spanish Empire accelerated sharply in the years following Margarita Teresa's death, a kingdom unraveling. Deprived of the Austrian alliance that her marriage was intended to cement, Spain found itself increasingly isolated in European politics, vulnerable and exposed. The War of the Spanish Succession, which erupted in 1701, was directly tied to the dynastic failures that her death symbolized, as European powers contested the inheritance of a monarchy that had been weakened by generations of inbreeding, a power struggle. Leopold's subsequent marriages underscored the futility of the Habsburg reproductive strategy, a flawed system. Despite marrying 2 more times and fathering additional children, the genetic damage caused by centuries of inbreeding continued to haunt the family, a legacy of disease. His sons suffered from the same health problems that had claimed previous Habsburg heirs, and the Austrian line itself would eventually vanish, burdened by the accumulated genetic toll of their incestuous marriage policy, a dynasty doomed by its own practices. Maria Antonia, Margarita Teresa's sole surviving child, became yet another casualty of the Habsburg system, a victim of the system. Married off at the age of 15 to Maximilian II Emmanuel of Bavaria, she died young after enduring a series of difficult pregnancies, perpetuating the cycle of suffering that had claimed her mother, a tragic continuation. Her own children inherited the genetic frailties of the Habsburg line, contributing to the eventual extinction of the Spanish branch of the family, a final collapse. The medical ramifications of Habsburg inbreeding became increasingly obvious in the generations following Margarita Teresa's death, a legacy of genetic damage. Charles II of Spain, her half-brother, was so severely afflicted by genetic problems that he could barely function as a ruler, a crippling condition. His inability to produce heirs led directly to the War of Spanish Succession and the demise of Habsburg rule in Spain, a disastrous consequence. Modern genetic analysis of Habsburg remains has confirmed that their inbreeding created a genetic catastrophe that made the dynasty's downfall inevitable, a scientific validation of their self-destruction. The cultural impact of Margarita Teresa's story resonated far beyond its immediate political consequences, a profound effect. Her tragic fate became a symbol of the human cost of absolute monarchy and the dangers of treating human beings as political commodities, a symbol of injustice. Enlightenment philosophers would later cite her story as evidence of the necessity for more humane approaches to marriage and governance, arguing that systems that sacrificed individual well-being for political gain were ultimately doomed to fail, a call for change. Perhaps most significantly, her death contributed to the erosion of the concept of divine monarchy, which had underpinned Habsburg power for centuries, a questioning of authority. The manifest failures of the inbreeding policy made it increasingly difficult to argue that royal blood was inherently superior or that God favored the Habsburg line, a crumbling ideology. The empire's decline following her death furnished concrete evidence that political systems founded on genetic superstition were fundamentally flawed, a demise based on flawed principles. Today, Margarita Teresa is remembered not for her tragic life or reproductive failures, but for her appearance in Velázquez's Las Meninas, a painting that has become one of the most analyzed and celebrated works in Western art, an ironic twist. This irony is striking. The girl who was valued solely for her biological function is now immortalized as a work of aesthetic beauty, divorced from the horrific realities of her actual existence, a lasting contradiction. The painting, executed when she was approximately 5 years old, captures her at the sole moment in her life when she was genuinely liberated from the reproductive expectations that would define her future, a moment of freedom. In Velázquez's composition, she appears as a true child, inquisitive, intelligent, and brimming with potential, a portrait of hope. The artist's brilliance lay in his capacity to perceive her as an individual human being rather than as a dynastic commodity, crafting a portrait that transcends the political calculations that surrounded her existence, a triumph of artistry. Art historians have noted the painting's unusual composition, with Margarita Teresa gazing directly at the viewer while encircled by court attendants and symbols of royal power, a deliberate arrangement. Some interpret this as a commentary on the isolation and artificiality of royal life, with the young princess confined within a world of ceremony and protocol that separates her from ordinary human experience, a critique of royal life. The painting becomes, in this interpretation, a subtle critique of the system that would eventually consume her, a hidden message. The contrast between the luminous child depicted in the painting and the tragic woman she became underscores the fundamental cruelty of the Habsburg system, a stark contrast. Velázquez captured her innate intelligence and spirit, qualities that should have been nurtured and celebrated, but were instead subordinated to her reproductive function, a squandered potential. The painting serves as a record of what was lost when the dynasty decreed that her value lay not in her mind or character, but in her womb. A tragic loss. Modern viewers of Las Meninas often remark on the haunting quality of Margarita Teresa's gaze, conveying a sense that she is looking directly into their souls, a powerful connection. This effect may be partly attributable to our awareness of her subsequent fate, a knowledge that colors our perception. We perceive in that innocent face the shadow of the suffering that awaited her, a premonition of tragedy. The painting becomes a form of memorial, preserving the memory of a child who deserved a better fate than the one that dynastic politics imposed upon her, a remembrance of injustice. The transformation of Margarita Teresa from historical victim to artistic symbol represents a form of posthumous justice, a symbolic reversal of fortune. While the Habsburg system valued her solely as a reproductive tool, history has chosen to remember her as Velázquez saw her, a remarkable individual worthy of artistic immortality, a lasting legacy. Her image in Las Meninas has outlived the empire that consumed her, ensuring that she is remembered for her humanity rather than her utility, a triumph of art over politics. The painting's enduring popularity serves as an indictment of the system that destroyed her, a constant reminder. Every viewer who admires the intelligence and vitality captured in her 5-year-old face is implicitly acknowledging the tragedy of what befell her afterward, a shared recognition of injustice. The artwork becomes a silent protest against the reduction of human beings to political and reproductive functions, celebrating the individual spirit that authoritarian systems seek to suppress. A powerful statement. The story of Margarita Teresa of Spain stands as one of history's most disturbing examples of institutional child abuse sanctioned by political expediency and religious doctrine. So, as we've seen, the story of Margarita Teresa, the golden-haired princess of Las Meninas, is far more than just a tale of royal life. It's a chilling reminder of how political ambition and blind adherence to tradition can twist and ultimately destroy individual lives, particularly those of the most vulnerable. It serves as a stark warning against sacrificing humanity on the altar of power and a poignant testament to the enduring value of every single life, regardless of status or circumstance. I hope you found this as thought-provoking as I did. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you most about Margarita Teresa's story? Did anything surprise you? Feel free to leave a comment below. I'd love to read your interpretations and answer any questions you might have. Let's start a conversation. And if you enjoyed delving into this hidden history with me, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future explorations of art, history, and the human condition. Thanks for watching.